Comrades and friends, good evening and welcome to this event hosted by the Friends of Bolivia. My name is Christine Blower. I'm a Labour peer and a friend of Bolivia and all-round activist about Latin America and so on. We're holding this event this evening because it is now 6 months since the military coup that removed President Evo Morales from office, putting in place what is clearly an illegitimate regime. Claims, as I'm sure you know, by the Organization of American States of irregularities in Morales' 10-point win over his nearest challenger were used to justify the coup, but have been roundly rejected by the Washington-based Center for Economic and Policy Research as deeply flawed. The resulting illegitimate regime, headed by coup President Janine Áñez, whose party secured only 4% in the election, has embarked on violent repression of those resisting the coup. And of course, I'm sure all of those of us on this call know who will be resisting the coup. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has reported that at least 36 people were killed after the coup, including 2 events which have been described as massacres. Former ministers in the Morales government, trade unionists and journalists, always in the front line in these circumstances, have been harassed and tortured. Bolivians continue to suffer not only harsh repression, but also savage austerity measures. And as the COVID-19 pandemic has spread across Latin America, these brutal austerity measures have led to a major health crisis in Bolivia, including a lack of basic medical supplies. So currently this has led to a significant number of deaths and putting further life in danger. So to hear more about the real situation on the ground in Bolivia, we have 2 speakers, and then I'm going to take a third briefly. Our first speaker is Ollie Vargas. He's going to speak for 15 or 20 minutes. He's a Bolivia-based journalist, reporting and writing direct from Bolivia, providing news and political analysis about Latin America and Bolivia in particular. He's a contributor to those organizations that many of us like to look at and read: Telesur, The Morning Star, The Grey Zone, Mint Press News, and other media outlets. And he presents a daily show on Bolivian radio station focused on supporting Bolivia's social movements. So, Ollie, we're very pleased that you were able to join us, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I was saying, I'm speaking to you from the offices of Radio Kausachun Kokam, which is a radio station owned and run by the Campesino unions, or rural workers unions, in the Chapare region of Bolivia, which is where Evo Morales was once a leader here as well. And it's the only media outlet really that hasn't handed over its editorial policy to the new regime. And for that reason, we face a number of threats, threats of closure. But to understand this new environment of persecution, we have to look back at how this coup happened. And the military coup that took place on November 10th of 2019 was an extraordinarily violent affair that had very little, that had a facade of grassroots involvement from roving protest groups, but in reality it was a very coordinated affair directed by certain coup leaders in conjunction with the US Embassy. So I think it's important to remember what actually happened 6 months ago on the day in which the coup took place. And the coup, first of all, the day began with the the publication of the OAS report that said that Evo Morales had won through electoral fraud. Now, we now know that that report was falsified, was manipulated to show the outcome, and that there's actually no evidence that Evo Morales committed electoral fraud. But that report was published in the early hours of the morning of Sunday morning on the 10th of November. And then what followed there was an outburst of terrorist violence on the streets. Huge numbers of people, senior members, senior leftists, members of the mass administration were hunted down, their houses were burned down. In one case, Victor Borda, who was the president of the House of Deputies in Bolivia, his house was burnt down and his brother was kidnapped. And all of this took place to pressure key people within the government to resign. And when they did, that caused the biggest destabilization within the government. And then that's when the military moved in and ordered Evo Morales to leave. So those are the sequence of events. But what followed that was an extremely, one of the darkest moments in Bolivian history, the darkest periods in Bolivian history, in particular, the huge repression and persecution that was meted out against those who resisted the coup. So in the first few days, protesters from this region, the CEPR region, were trying to march towards the city of Cochabamba. And as they were arriving and they're passing through the town of Sacaba, they were shot at from military helicopters that were flying about 40 meters from the ground. 9 people lost their lives that day at the hands of the military, and the youngest person at that massacre was just 17 years old, Omar Kaye. So that was then followed by yet another massacre against the people in the city, the indigenous city of El Alto, in the working class neighborhood of Sencata, and they were blocking the roads to try and stop the government from moving fuel about the city. They hoped this would weaken the government, and so the state sent in once again the military and opened fire on protesters. So that was the first week of the coup. The first week of a US-backed government in Bolivia was inaugurated with 2 massacres against overwhelmingly indigenous protesters who were opposed to the coup. But since then, since the so-called pacification of the country, which is what the government call it, what you've seen since then is a persecution aimed at certain individuals. So the most prominent candidates, left-wing candidates for the mass, have been targeted for fake charges. Andrónico Rodriguez, he's a 30-year-old union leader. He's the union leader of in this area, the CEPR region, and he has 4 different charges against him relating to so-called sedition, terrorism, just for saying that he plans to organize marches. His sedition charges are for referring to the government as a coup government, and the government say that is a form of essentially not recognizing the Áñez regime, and therefore that's sedition and punishable with jail. So that's something that's hanging over him. Even the presidential candidate of the movement towards socialism, Luis Arce, he also has charges for which there have no kind of evidence has been presented, and which were announced the day after he was declared to be the candidate, the presidential candidate for the mass. And the list of the number of people who've been persecuted, being given false charges been thrown against them is too long to say in a single event such as this. But it's a terror that exists amongst everyone who dares to criticize the government, anyone who remembers fondly the days of Evo Morales when Bolivia built an indigenous popular democracy. So that's the climate of persecution that has been hanging over Bolivia for 6 months now. So what's happened now with the outbreak of coronavirus in Bolivia? Well, the response in terms of public health has been appalling. Bolivia is the country that does the least number of COVID-19 tests. However, what the government has been doing is intensifying repression even more. So a number of operations have been taken place in this region, in the Chapada region, where following the coup, police were actually expelled from this part of the country because of the strength of the anti-coup resistance. And now the government, through force, basically sent in the military and sent in the police to retake their positions. And when people initially rejected this, and there were protests about 2 weeks ago against the presence of the police, the regime responded by cutting off fuel and banks to this whole region. So people couldn't even withdraw their money, elderly people couldn't access their pensions, single mothers who were supposed to be given a welfare payment, a bono as it's called, weren't able to access that. So it was a form of economic sanctions placed on the areas where the left has the most support, such as this region, the Chapada region. As well, we've seen all kinds of decrees. Just yesterday, a decree was admitted by the self-declared President Áñez, which says that anyone guilty of so-called spreading doubt during the coronavirus, during quarantine online, can face jail. And they face jail whether this is in written form, in print form, even artistic form. That's how she extended it. So Bolivians find it incredibly difficult during this quarantine because a large proportion of the country works in the informal economy, works selling things day by day, and those people have lost their incomes during the lockdown. However, instead of providing some sort of income support, the government has abandoned them. In Argentina, for example, rent payments have been suspended, direct payments have been made to those who've lost their incomes. Those are the measures brought in under the progressive government of Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, whereas in Bolivia, there's been no deferral on loan payments, no suspension of rent payments, and all that's being given out is some people, elderly and mothers, been given a bono, a social welfare payment of around $60 for this entire period, which is now almost 2 months of lockdown. So people are facing hunger on a huge scale. In some cities, in the city of Montero and Santa Cruz, a 12-year-old girl committed suicide because she couldn't take the pain of being constantly hungry, because her city was placed on lockdown because of the outbreak of coronavirus. So Bolivians face a twin evil. First of all, they face hunger and misery, now that so many have lost their incomes and been abandoned under this US-backed regime. However, many also face, one moment, I think there's a problem. I'm going to move around to here. Sorry, that was a technical issue. But as I was saying, the people facing a humanitarian crisis in terms of hunger after being abandoned by this coup regime. However, if they go out to protest, they face up to 10 years in jail. The government has said that anyone who goes out during this period, during this lockdown period, will be criminalized. So people don't know what to do. They feel locked down in their homes. However, as everyone knows, staying at home in quarantine is very easy when you have a house of 10 rooms, a mansion with a fully stocked fridge and all your basic services. But for a working class Bolivian family who, maybe has 4 or 5 children in a small house where they're not able to go out and earn money, this lockdown has been incredibly difficult, and the government hasn't provided any support. All they've done is threaten people with jail. Last night, families who were hungry in the cities of La Paz, Cochabamba, Santa Cruz began banging pots and pans in protest of the current government. And in response, today, the military has been flying war planes, low-flying war planes over the cities of El Alto as a means of intimidation, to let people know that if they dare to come out again, if they dare to protest, to make their voices heard ever again, then the state is ready to launch military warfare against their own population. And this mobilization of the military has been something, as a form of threatening the population, has been something present throughout this entire period. So Bolivians face hunger, they face repression. So the demands of the social movements that survived this period is for new elections. Elections were supposed to take place on May the 3rd. However, they were suspended due to coronavirus, which most people accepted. However, the government has made it clear that they intend to rule almost indefinitely without, they don't want to set a date for when elections can next be held. So they want to rule without having ever won an election, with the support of the US Embassy and the military alone. And that's how they want to govern the country for an almost indefinite amount of time. So people are coming out, banging their pots and pans, posting to social media, demanding elections as the only way out of the political crisis in Bolivia. And the government's response has been saying that, oh, well, those who call for elections clearly don't care about public health. They don't care about containing coronavirus. The social movements here have been really clear in saying that the only way that this country can overcome this pandemic, this health threat, is by having a democratic government that has a link to the public, that cares about people because it is brought in by the people. Unlike this current government, which has never been elected, which was brought in by the military and by the US Embassy, and it's to those forces that they're accountable. And that's why the coronavirus has hit Bolivia incredibly hard. The city of Santa Cruz, for example, which is an opposition, for a right-wing stronghold, has almost 60% of all the coronavirus cases in Bolivia, and almost no ventilators to help those who are ill. Health workers have come out to protest in El Alto in Santa Cruz because they don't have the right equipment to go into the hospital. Some of them are going in with rain ponchos that are worth 50 cents. So people said that the only way to overcome this, not just the poor response to coronavirus, but also the way to overcome the economic crisis that's been brewing for the last 6 months, is to have elections, is to have a government that is democratically elected by the people. So, in accordance with that, the MPs for the Mass in Parliament passed a law that said elections must be held within 90 days. However, the government has said that they don't intend to respect this, and then they'll do everything they can to basically suspend the elections indefinitely. So now it's important, I think, that everyone around the world knows that Bolivia is in the middle of a democratic struggle, of a struggle for elections, a struggle for free speech, and all of the persecution, the racism, and the neoliberal economic reforms that are going on right now. This is the model for how forces backed by the US govern in Latin America. We've seen the ongoing coup attempts in Venezuela this past week, 2 weeks. And so when we look at Bolivia, we see what they want to impose there. They want to impose a government that burns the flags of ethnic minorities, because that was the first, we have to remember, that was the first act of right-wing protesters following the coup, was to burn the indigenous Huipala flag. That tells you what their cultural politics are, that tells you what their values are. Another, following that, some of the first measures that were brought in after the coup was to re-establish relations with the US and with Israel, and to turn away from Latin American allies such as Cuba, Venezuela. And then following that, we've seen the huge corruption, especially within the nationalized industries such as BOA and Entel, the state airline and the telecommunications industry, which have been looted by regime officials with the aim of sort of wearing them down until they can be privatized. So when we see the sequence of events, we see the sequence of events that the US wants to impose on other countries in Latin America. This is the sequence of events they want to impose in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Nicaragua. So I hope that the example of Bolivia, of what's going on in Bolivia, can show the world the approach which the US takes to Latin America, the way in which they rule through racism, through violence, through repression, through persecution. And I hope as well that this message, the message of the Bolivian social movement, can reach everyone, can be an example as well. Because it's extraordinary the way in which Bolivia's social movements, despite all of this repression, have remain organized, kept themselves intact. So I hope that can serve as an example to workers struggling everywhere in the world.
Ollie, thank you very much indeed for that very fulsome picture of what's going on in Bolivia. You'll be pleased to know that your words were heard by people who are watching in Huddersfield, in Glasgow, in London, in Leicester, in Oxford, in Sheffield, in Belfast, and in Norway. So there you are.
Fantastic.
We've got people all around the place listening to this, because clearly this is such an important issue, and 6 months after the coup is the time for us to say we really do need to be paying attention to what's going on in Bolivia. So thank you very much, Ollie. And now I'm going to move to our second speaker. We've been joined by Manuel Bueno, who is a Bolivian trade unionist, who has contributed his knowledge and experience and critical analysis to many solidarity events over the years. Manuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Ollie has given a very comprehensive description and details of what's happening in Bolivia now, so I won't repeat that. What I would like to do instead is put some perspective on the situation now, and in particular on the Morales period in Bolivian history and the contrast of this government to that period. Now, Bolivian history has been full of government changes, most of them, unfortunately, changes by military coup. However, there has been some democratic elected popular governments, particularly since 1952. Up to then, there was mainly military governments, or essentially governments backed by the military, and which represented mainly the small elite at the top, which owned the mines and the land for agriculture. In 1952, there was the first fairly deep popular revolution, and it was a revolution because it followed an election which was annulled when the MNR, a civilian popular government, was elected. So because of that, there was an uprising mainly led by the Bolivian TUC, the COB, and the miners' unions. And that resulted in a change of government which instituted some very profound, deep changes, namely the nationalization of the mines and the giving of the breakup of the land holdings held by small landlords to the tillers, the people working in that land. And finally, the other two big reforms was universal elections, where everybody could vote, and based on simple citizenship, with no requirement of literacy or whatever, and for men and women who could vote, and educational reform. those changes were quite fundamental to the previous Bolivia. And what that change brought about the entry into the politics of Bolivia, the active politics of the large indigenous population who were mainly peasants working in the land, the miners, and the workers in the factories. That change inevitably meant that governments had to have a fairly popular policy, left-wing popular policy. And so the MNR had this tension. On the one hand, the domination of the US government, which wanted right-wing politics and the preservation of the elite and the capitalist system, and the popular bases who were needed to stay in power and to win. And so that led to a very unstable situation for quite a long time. And it made the government, various Bolivian governments, however elected, largely very tied to US policy, but pulled by popular forces. And that instability eventually was broken when various right-wing governments tried to reverse the changes by programs of privatization and attempts to nationalize the oil industry, the gas industry, the mines, etc. And that huge fight about that led eventually to the election of the Morales government. Now, this was unusual because prior to that, the Bolivian left had been led by essentially the mining union leaders and their proletarian city leaders from the factories. But they had been suppressed by the military government. So they were, in a way, partly out of the picture. But what they didn't manage to suppress was the large agricultural sector of which Morales was a part. He grew coca, which, unlike what people think, is not grown in Bolivia for cocaine, but it's consumed as a leaf that's chewed by most people, particularly in the factories and countryside. And this is grown in various parts of Bolivia, one part being the Chapare. In that area, a lot of trade union leaders who had been displaced and therefore had to become agricultural people were very well organized. And it was there that Evo Morales came through as a leader. And when there was a new big crisis about nationalization, particularly of water in the area of Cochabamba, it was his movement, along with all sorts of others, that finally were able to overcome the repression of the military because it was so large, the resistance, and eventually force an election which was won by Evo Morales with an unprecedented 55% of the vote. Most previous elections had always been won by minority votes. But this was a huge majority vote, 55%. and that very majority meant that the Morales government had a very large mandate and very large support. And the opposition, the right-wing opposition, was completely discredited and broken. And so that led to a period which was very unusual in Bolivian history, in which a progressive government had hegemony for 3 periods of elections, something like 12, 13 years. And what made it particularly important is that that was well used. That period was used to recover Bolivian resources by nationalizing the parts that were given to multinationals, but particularly the oil and gas industry and the various mines, by promoting employment and industry, by giving land, breaking up the latifundia and giving land to the peasantry, etc. So there was a very large number of reforms which benefited a very large number of people, and what made it especially important in Bolivia was the racial ethnic aspect of it. Bolivia is unique among Latin American countries in that the majority of the indigenous population survived the colonial period. It's a majority, shall we say, Indian country of various indigenous nationalities, who had quite an important background of organization during the period of the Incas and so on. So an aspect of the Morales government was to revive that culture and that participation of the Aymara and Quechua and all those people. In other words, the majority indigenous population. That has meant that for the very first time in Bolivian history, the majority native population has been part of the citizenship. And that means that the change to a reactionary government faces an enormous task in time to undo that. So
great.
It is my belief that the period of reaction is necessarily temporary.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manuel, for that sweep of history. We do have a third speaker, Miriam, who I'm going to come to in a second, but I just want you to know that on the call, we also have people from Norwich, from Old Windsor, from Croydon, from Wolverhampton, from Manchester and Newcastle, and my old friend and comrade Ray Sorokin from France. Now, our third speaker, who is, I'm afraid, going to have much less time, just a couple of minutes, Miriam, is Miriam Kolke. And Miriam, the floor is yours, okay? Couple of minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I know we are remembering the tragic 6 months coup d'etat in Bolivia. And I wanted to briefly raise one point about the unsung heroes. In November 2019, and in the midst of the rampant violence by fascism at the head of Camacho, Pumari, etc., the first victim falls. Sebastián Moro, an Argentine journalist who worked for Rural Press, an alternative means of communication of the Trade Union Confederation of Rural Workers from Bolivia, CESUTCB. Sebastián Moro was the first to denounce the coup d'etat at national and international level, where he announced that the extreme right had locked up the Bolivian people on the worst of their nights, according to the testimony of Penelope Moro, Sebastián's sister. This brutal violence of those who vilified to Compañero Evo also spread against all the journalists and conscientious media who paid a heavy price. On the 10th of November 2019, Sebastián Moro was found with blows to his body, and 6 days later he died. Today, 6 months after, we remember his departure. Sebastián Moro was one more victim in addition to the long list of our heroes killed in Sacaba and Sencata by the dictatorial regime of Jeanine Áñez and her executioners. Today, 6 months after the bloody coup, we want to raise awareness on the case of Compañero Sebastián Moro and also send all our solidarity to their loved ones. We demand justice for the death of Compañero Sebastián Moro and the freedom of Facundo Morales, another Argentinian compañero, and for all our brothers who were killed, injured, jailed, censored, and persecuted. Justice. Out, Áñez. Out. Elections now. Thank you.
Miriam, thank you very much for that contribution. Let me just say that that Ollie Vargas, our first speaker, has a few connectivity issues. We're hoping he's going to be able to come back on, because I have got a couple of questions that I'm going to try and put to Manuel and to Ollie. But before I do that, you will not be at all surprised that Jeremy Corbyn has tweeted this evening about this meeting and about the 6 months that have passed since the coup. His tweet says, "It's 6 months since the coup against Evo Morales. We stand with the people in Bolivia struggling for democracy, equality, and social justice." All of the things that are dear to our hearts and the values that we hold good and true. And of course, it's not a surprise that we hear that from Jeremy. I don't know whether anyone's in a position to be able to tell me whether we think we'll be able to get Ollie back on the call. No. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask Manuel perhaps these couple of questions that have come in, and if we get Ollie back in, we'll see if he has some remarks he wants to make about this too. So the two questions that have come in are a very interesting question. Is this happening in Bolivia because of lithium and others trying to get control of it? And the second question is, what is the stance of different forces in the US to development in Bolivia, as well as Trump and Biden, for example? So are there other voices that we hear from the United States of America other than those? So we know that Ollie knows those questions. So if he manages to get back on the call, he will be in a position to say something. But I don't know if you would like to make some remarks in response to either of those, Manuel?
Right. Lithium is an important consideration by the multinationals and right-wing forces in Bolivia. As I said in my initial talk, the reactionary elite completely depends on foreign capital to stay in power. They cannot gain popular support. And in order to do that, their program is essentially to sell the country to sell its resources. Before it was mainly tin and copper and the minerals of deep mining, which still are a factor. But of course, lithium as a more modern important element for the development of batteries and also is now an important thing. The Morales government had an important program to try and have resources not only being controlled by Bolivia in terms of exporting, rather than that being exploited and sold by multinationals, but also to develop Bolivian industry, so as to not just exporting raw materials, but to manufacture as much as possible within Bolivia to get maximum benefit. That meant, of course, that this was outside the potential control of the multinationals. So, yeah, there is a compatibility between the Áñez reactionary government and foreign multinationals who would want control of lithium. Yes. There was the stance in the US. Well, I mean, as in Britain, the people in the US are not necessarily reflected by the government. There are, you know, if you took British foreign policy, you would think that the British people are completely reactionary, but of course that we know that is not the case. I don't know to what extent that is the same in the US, but we do know that there are very important progressive forces there, and they do not see the future of the US purely in terms of US imperialism. They can see a future in which control of the US economy for the people and in commercial relations with the rest are possible.
There was a question asked about lithium and whether the presence of lithium in Bolivia is a significant issue in terms of what's happening. And the second question, what are there other forces and voices in the US, the likes of Sanders, for example, other people who are more supportive of the progressives in Bolivia?
Yes, well, I think the question with the lithium is most important, because we have to remember lithium is an incredibly important raw material that's been called by some the gold of the future, because it's a material that's going to be used in batteries, in electric cars, sort of electrical appliances, especially sort of newer forms of it. So lithium is, Bolivia has, as you say, the largest known reserves of lithium. Chile and Argentina have small amounts, but Bolivia has the most. And Bolivia was set to exploit this and industrialize this resource through under a nationalized company, YLB, in conjunction with one foreign company, which is a German company, in a deal in which the Bolivian state would maintain majority control over the process of industrialization. So there's a lot of forces clearly who want to be part of the exploitation of this natural resource, and those. And also, I should say, to stop the process of industrialization, because Bolivia, its role that it's supposed to have in the global economy is as a country that exports cheap raw materials that can then be processed in countries like the US, in Europe. So the fact that Bolivia was trying to do all of the process within the country disrupted a kind of neo-colonial global order. So there was a lot of interests that were keen to stop that process. And now the entire process of industrialization, of production of cars, of batteries, which had already begun on the factory, completely paralyzed. And the people in that area where they're producing the lithium, which is in the salt flats of Uyuni, they're fighting back at the moment. They're organizing at a union level, neighborhood level, to try and stop what's going on, stop the privatization, to try and restart the project of incredibly important. Evo Morales himself said that this was a coup against lithium, against Bolivian ownership of lithium. And with the new economy minister has already said that after coronavirus, the economic plan, which Bolivia will have to sort of implement to recuperate, will be allowing numerous, he said, allowing multiple foreign companies to come in and exploit the lithium. So that's, I think, certainly will be a casualty if this coup government can sort of cling on to power for more than a few months. But if elections can disrupt that, then Bolivians have a chance to recoup their lithium.
Thank you, Ollie. There was also a question about whether there are other forces in the United States of America who might be more positive to a progressive position. I should just tell you that we've been joined on this call generally by people from the Netherlands, but also from the United States. So let's hope they're good people from the United States who want to be positive about making things much better in Bolivia. So do you have a sense that there might be positive forces in the US?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's just from when I talk about Bolivia, when I try and share what's going on in Bolivia, I think there's a huge number of people. There's always a very large number of people from the US who begin to draw parallels. They begin to say, like, well, if this is what the US is doing in Bolivia, then what is it that they're doing in Venezuela? What's our government doing? How can we begin to hold them to account? And I was contacted a few months ago by an anti-war group in the US that there were constituents of one of the presidential candidates, former candidates, Elizabeth Warren, and they were organizing petitions and pickets of our office to try and get her to come out against the coup in Bolivia. They weren't able to actually get her to shift her position because Elizabeth Warren, like a number of senior members of the Democratic Party, don't have policies that are friendly to Latin America or anywhere else in the global South. But there are efforts being made in the US to try and shift the position. And I'm sure that now, in this health crisis, America, is the country with the highest number of cases, of coronavirus cases, of deaths. And I think a growing number of Americans, and I see them on my own pages, commenting on the things I post, saying that, I hope our government can start to, looking at democracies, destroying sort of nationalized industries and economies of other countries in the global South.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ollie. Let me just say that brings us to the end of the questions that we've had and the end of our scheduled speakers for this evening. I think it's been an extremely good meeting and a very timely matter for us to be talking about the coup in Bolivia 6 months on from when it happened. And it is incumbent upon us, trade unionists and internationalists and socialists in this country and globally, to stand with our comrades in Bolivia who are struggling for democracy, struggling against the coup regime. And so I encourage you, if you've been on this call, to follow the Friends of Bolivia on Twitter and on Facebook, and to join the over 1,000 people who have already signed up in Britain, urging to the solidarity statement 6 months on from the coup, and standing in solidarity with those friends who oppose the coup regime and who are in and who are in very difficult circumstances, many of them. So my thanks once again to Miriam and to Manuel and to Ollie for joining us this evening and for bringing us those voices about what is really happening in Bolivia. Thank you to those of you who joined the call, and I look forward to much more activism on the question of Bolivia as we move forward out of lockdown, and we can perhaps meet in person rather than virtually. So thank you very much, and good night.